I don't remember if I talked about this during my Bastion rumination, but one of the things that really struck me before I picked up Bastion was I was kind of against the game because it felt like a artsy game. And I think I've made it clear I tend to not like artsy things. To make my point more clear, obviously I think video games are art. I think it's ridiculous and stupid to try and emphasize otherwise. But when I say artsy, I mean the kind of person who insists that, oh, I'm not making a video game, I'm making art. As if being the thought of them making a video game is insulting and making a clear distinction between art and video game. That kind of personality tends to irritate me, and there's actually quite a few people in the video game industry who make art, and they're artsy and they tend to irritate me. I've talked about this before. I've actually disagreed with some of my viewers on this point before. Positively, we've had reasonable discourse on the matter. So when I first was looking at Bastion, I'm like, eh, and that was pretty much my reaction. I played it and I liked it. It had a lot of good. It had some bad too. I'll be honest. There were some issues with the control scheme, but considering the development team, it was pretty impressive. Then this game came out. Now I bought Transistor basically when it came out. This is the first time I've played it. I never actually got around to being able to actually play the game that I bought. I'm sure a lot of you have that problem too. The whole backlog issue. But I bought it on faith because of Bastion. I was sold. I was ready to go. I might not have bought it like when it came out, but it was pretty soon. It was pretty soon after it came out. I didn't wait particularly long. And having played through this game, and having looked at their next game, Pyre, I've finally come to a conclusion about Supergiant Games, the developers here. I think they're doing what I would like to do in an ideal world, like if money wasn't an issue. Not that I would imply that I could make great games. Actually, quite the contrary. I'm pretty sure my games would be terrible. But the point is, I wouldn't be making games for them to be blockbuster hits. I wouldn't be making games to make them be super amazing bestsellers. I'd be making games to try and explore things in the medium. Try to get story ideas out there. You've got a bunch of... I know a lot of you understand what I mean by this when you just say, you have a bunch of creative clay here, and you want to try to rip a chunk out and do something with it. And so... I really get the strong impression that's exactly what Supergiant Games have been doing, is they want to tell this story, they want to tell this story. I very much feel, I don't remember if I covered this in my Bastion rumination, it's been a while, but I very much feel that this is a tale, not a story. I've talked about this concept several times, and I do think that it very much helps to inform. Bastion was kind of that way too. Too much of the game and too much of the plot and setting didn't make that much linear sense. The kind of thing that isn't really self-contiguous, doesn't really fit within its own rules. It's just a tale. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to serve a purpose, right? And I get that impression very, very strongly with Transistor. Although that being said, I will say that Transistor feels more like it could be a setting than Bastion did. Bastion felt like a storybook. This feels more like something I could see in like a sci-fi thriller kind of a situation. Someplace that I could actually see as actually existing, in other words. One other thing I want to comment on, some people have said this is just Bastion 2.0. I really think that is a huge disservice to both Bastion and to Transistor. And I think that that's basically a concept, one of the biggest flaws of bullet point syndrome, well described right there. Because if you bullet point Bastion, you'll have Transistor. But if you've actually played both games, they're actually quite different. The analogy I came up with while I was playing it is, because, there's such a musical thing throughout Transistor, even though Transistor and Bastion have several of the same beats, the song is completely different. So, like I said, this is another non-standard reality situation. There's this world, may or may not exist in a computer, we'll cover that later, and, they have the ability to change the sky and make things and destroy things, and it'd be kind of like living in Minecraft, if Minecraft is actually a real thing, total control over the server. And it starts off in medias res, in one of the most just wow kind of things ever. Because it's like I fire up the game and it's like, okay, pull the sword out. And then immediately gameplay, it's like, whoa, okay. This is the second game I've played recently, the other one being This War of Mine, that just jumps you right into the gameplay. The gameplay itself is the first thing I want to talk about. I feel like this is what a modern Fallout game would look like. If they made Fallout 1 or Fallout 2 now, I think this is what it would look like. Not the first-person shooter thing. Yes, I like Fallout 3 in New Vegas. I even like Fallout 4, and I get blasted for my opinion on that fact, and that's fine. But if we were to make Fallout 1 and 2, I think this is what it would look like. Not Wasteland, or Wasteland 2, excuse me. Although that was certainly an acceptable game, and I hope to actually give that a try again now that they've got the director's cut out. But this, because it basically has the VATS system. It's basically an action game without the VATS system. So instead of being fully turn-based and dependent on the VATS system, it's fully action-based, and then you can activate the VATS system. And the funny thing is, that's what the modern Fallouts do. Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4 are all fully action-based. It's just FPS instead of top-down. And you can then basically pause to do VATS, right? You see why I say this would be kind of a modern take on the Fallout setting. And I felt like it was a really fun mix because with a few exceptions, I found that I could actually ignore the turn-based thing, the VATS thing, turn, parentheses, parentheses. I could pretty much ignore the turn ability entirely if I felt like it and just go through and play the action version if I was quick enough. And that was actually a lot of fun. I could also pretty much ignore the action thing, just do the turn thing, run away until my action bar is reloaded, do the turn thing, run away until my action bar is reloaded, etc. Both playstyles, and of course the third playstyle, which I guess is the default, which is doing both equally, all three of these are valid. It's very tightly controlled, and I think the gameplay here is much better designed than Bastion was. I think it shows that they actually did learn a lot of their lessons from Bastion. I'm sorry, I just realized the music isn't playing. Oh wait, no, music is playing. Wow, the music's playing, I didn't even realize it. I guess I just always have music playing. It's always playing in my head, so, what do you want from me? So, I also feel that the bosses, such as they were, I shouldn't even call them bosses. There's really only two serious bosses in the game. Sybil and Royce. And both of them were awesome. Royce especially. That was such a great game, great boss battle. And a great way to tie things up where he's got his own transistor, so now he can do the stuff you can. He now has access to the great ability that you have, turn, and can do the same thing you can. And that was actually pretty damn rough going through that. I admittedly got some help from several speedrunners who gave me some tips about, here's some combos and here's some abilities you really want to use that are just going to enable you to wreck face. And they were right, of course. I like the bookends of the game. I guess, see, I'm kind of moving on from gameplay. I don't have much else to share about gameplay. I want to talk about the art design because it's beautiful. This is an absolutely gorgeous game, and it's not just gorgeous in the sense that it looks good. In fact, actually, it's more of an aesthetic thing than a quality thing. However, I did very much like the aesthetic. One of the things that jumped out at me immediately is the people who were partially processed. Looks simultaneously very clean, very clinical, and yet at the same time absolutely horrifying. It's the kind of horror I tend to enjoy, because rather than showing their guts all splayed out like, most typical horror films will do, or most typical horror games will do, it shows them partially digitized into the processed white blocks, and you're left with the implication of what's happening to them, and that was much more horrifying and much more appealing to me personally, and I like that. One of the things I want to talk about is the musical inference. I know this is going to be a weird parallel, but I was reminded of FF10-2 here, because the theme of music is pretty much all throughout this game. Now that makes sense, Red herself being a singer, and I'll talk more about that later. But the idea of... I mentioned the tale thing. I mentioned how this feels more like a tale than a story. Part of what I mean by that is this feels like a song. Not intended to be taken completely literally, but more like a ballad, a rock opera, if you will, about these events and how this happens. And it's funny because the song, I can't think of the name of it. I read it up on it. It's like all, no small all, or all small around or something. Somebody's going to tell me it in the comments. You always do. That song pretty much tells the plot of the game. And I feel like this is the kind of thing that would be sung. In fact, I'm a little surprised they didn't literally have a singer to do that, to actually sing the narration rather than having the same narration style of Bastion. And if I'm being blunt, I think the narration thing is probably the biggest weakness of Transistor. Not that it isn't good, don't mistake me, but this is the one thing that truly is basically taken from Bastion, the narration thing. The fact that he just kind of narrates and talks through. He does it in a different style. He's not saying, and then the kid did this, and then the kid did that. He is literally talking to us live. The sword is talking to us rather than a narrator narrating the story. But in effect, in implementation, it's the same basic thing, and I believe the same actor as well. And I felt like it was a little bit weaker for that, and they could have done something else with that, like singing. There was some good bookends in this game, too. The whole game, and again, this kind of goes back to the musical thing, the whole game feels like a pattern that repeats itself right down the middle. It's mirrored. You have this whole escalation as things are getting worse and worse, and the revelation happens, and Sybil goes down, and you get over here, and then you come all the way back, and everything's basically gone. Hello, world, get back, and then the final battle happens, and you're right there, right by the corpse of Blue, right when you were... right where you started the game at. And the game ends pretty much exactly in the same tone as how it began. I'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk about... I'm going to try and hit these in what I consider to be the closest thing to an order that I can, okay? Let's talk about what Transistor is. I mentioned that it's not supposed to be literal. Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons is an excellent example of another non-literal story, a tale. But the more I thought about it, the more I came to think that while that is true, this setting can and does actually exist. Like I said, more than Bastion's does. Because what I was picturing was Earthworld. Hear me out. I know some of you, in fact, I imagine most of you have no idea what I'm talking about. There's a webcomic called Earthworld, ERF, okay? And in that world, it's a turn-based setting. To try and explain what I mean a little bit more clearly, it's a setting that actually has turns and the rules of like a tabletop war game, like BattleTech or Warhammer 40k or whatever, except that's it in lore. Like they actually have to adhere to those rules and that idea and the way those rules are interpreted into lore as an everyday reality of how they function, right? And much of the story is exploring what it's like for an outsider, a normal person from Earth, to be transported there and try to deal with this setting that functions so completely differently than standard reality. I bring this up, I use that as the penultimate example of a setting that doesn't follow standard rules. Imagine if you lived in Minecraft, for example. In fact, this was actually the impetus for the Rogue Planet storyline that Zanasma and I were doing for a while there. That, what would it be like in lore to exist in a setting where the rules are just so fundamentally different than your standard rule set? Planetoids and dimensions and physics and all those things that exist in like 99% of all settings, right? I think Transistor is one of those. I think this is a setting that is trying very hard to make me sneeze, and I'm trying very hard to resist it. I think this is a setting that basically functions as if it was a computer program, but I don't think it is a computer program. Now let me explain what I mean by this. I actually looked into a lot of the theory crafting of this game, and there's a lot. Because the other big flaw of the game, in my opinion, is they don't explain things. I know that's done on purpose. I don't care. It's still, personally, I would rather have some explanation for most storytelling styles, and have a few things unexplained, rather than having giant gaping holes in the story because you're supposed to interpret it yourself. So tons and tons of theory crafting. The most common thing I heard, and I heard this over and over and over, was that this is happening in a computer program. This is a Tron situation. Not the Matrix, that's kind of different. Tron, specifically, living beings inside a program. And the way that they work and the way they function within their confines. And someone put in a delete command or whatever, and that's what's happening over the course of the game. And the country is like the recycling bin or whatever, right? All sorts of different theories, but all of them centered around that concept. The more I thought about it, the more I didn't think that was true. I think this is just a setting that exists as if it existed in a computer program. As if, rather than me reaching out to grab a drink and take a drink, what I do is I use command drink, parentheses, period, and then I can do it. Make sense? It probably doesn't, because it's very non-standard. That's the whole point of it. It felt like a setting where the rules as we are here don't apply. And part of the reason I felt this, the more I went through the game, is because of that whole thing I mentioned right at the beginning of this rumination, that the group of people, the Supergiant Games, they're just trying things. They're getting chunks of clay out there, their own creative thoughts and ideas, and just trying to put them out there. Rather than saying, what would it be like if we lived in a computer, they're saying, what would it be like if we lived as if we were a computer? And all the potential storytelling and creative concepts you can pull out of that. There's actually quite a few. They could keep going with that concept, to be perfectly blunt. That leads me to my next point, excuse me, which is Blue. I know this sounds weird, but hear me out, okay? So Blue, which is what I hear fans most commonly refer to him, he's the guy in the sword. You know, your lover, although it's never actually stated he's your lover. It's just kind of implied a few times. I don't actually think he was just Red's lover. I actually have a different theory on the matter. The more I read about it, the more I read the backstory, I think Blue was her bodyguard. Red was a singer, and she was singing things so controversial that they actually caused altercations, that they actually set up situations where security had to be called in. So the idea of her having a bodyguard, and him being a relatively recent addition to her life, makes sense to me. It would also make sense that in that kind of an intimate environment there could be a relationship there, or it could just be a friendship. It doesn't matter, because either way there is still a connection between those two people. I also want to say why I think the controversy was, because that was a really sticking point for me. I know I'm a weird person and I tend to think about setting things like that, but it's never stated outright why her singing was so controversial. And I read the lyrics of every one of the songs that's in the game to try and figure out, because the way that these people usually do this is they have the singing in the game. You know, the music we're listening to is being sung by the characters in game. You know, they did that in Bastion as well. The whole wall song was a great metaphor for what was happening in Bastion, for example. I think she was singing about concepts of linearity and solidarity. This is a society that is a morphic world. Truly morphic. Imagine for a moment if you could vote on what the weather is tomorrow. Imagine if you could decide what was built where, or at least you could have a vote. You have a say in that. And obviously your vote may not mean that much in your neighborhood, in your city or whatever, but you could talk to other people. You know, if you really want that new mall built, you just have to talk to people and interact with people and say, well, maybe we do this, and get enough people on your side. This is basically the definition of politics, by the way. Enough people listening to you, enough people agreeing with you, that when the vote comes in, you get that new mall made, right? Make sense? You get that petition put out to have a new bridge designed or whatever. Imagine that kind of a morphic world, which has, like, it's basically like as if we were living in a holodeck, except the holodeck was our everyday life. There was no leaving the holodeck, right? You have that control. The only catch is the democracy is what's kind of running things. Now, granted, the Camerata, I can't remember how he pronounces it, are the people actually in charge of the changes. But my point is, what I think was happening here was that everyone was so used to this massively fluid society that they reached a point of creative excess. We had almost a BioShock situation here, where there was so much of the philosophy of, to put it bluntly, hedonism within this city, and overindulgence, that the idea of leaving a bridge there and not changing it, letting the weather play out the way it should, not tearing down buildings just because you want to make a new building there, you know, basically trying to function in a more static, a more solidified kind of a setting, right? To try and temper the amount of excess that we were using this power. And indeed, that is one of the plot points, is that the Camerata was tired of the fact that everyone was doing everything so much that it was creating this fluid society, right? I think Red was on board with that, and she was singing about, you know, what if we were all as one? What if we were all, you know... And then, of course, that was such an unpopular opinion amongst the hedonists, amongst the society, that they were like, "Rah!" and turned into Wario and started attacking her with gold coins. It was terrible. This is, of course, pure theory, but everything I read in the game kind of leans me in this direction, especially with regards to how Sybil was talking about Red in her journals, in her dialogues and whatnot. This also ties me into one of the most fascinating thing about this entire setting. I've kind of already discussed it. I feel so bad when I have a short video like this, because there's just an idea and it's fascinating, but I don't know what else to talk about it. The idea of a morphic world fascinates me beyond words. Even if it is within a computer program, which, again, I don't really think it is. But the idea of having a world where you have the tools to just say, tomorrow, snow. I think that building should go away. Like, it would actually be kind of like living in Sims 3 specifically. Now, if you don't know what I mean by that, imagine if you could live in Sims 3 in lore. If you don't understand the significance, have you ever worked on a house? I've only worked on like one in my life. It was way long ago. But like my dad's building a house right now, okay? And that involves, digging up stuff and laying down pipe and putting those things. What does building a house involve in Sims 3? Well, oh, hang on. And then we got to put the toilet here. No, my favorite example of how Sims 3 is completely non-standard is you can move a toilet in minutes, in seconds actually, with no consequences. You don't have to readjust the plumbing. You don't have to move the pipes or whatever. You just take a toilet and move it over here. It still works. That's the kind of setting that Transistor is. They could just move stuff around. They could just change things. They could directly affect the code of their reality. Again, whether they're a computer program or whether they just emulate one, doesn't matter. And that's fascinating to me. That would be so interesting and so horrifying at the same time to live in a setting like that. And it makes so much sense to me that part of the reason that the process got so far out of control was because of the fact that the process, without controls on it, reverts to default state, which is exactly what they were doing to the entire city, just wiping the slate clean and reverting everything down to default in order to prepare for whatever. I don't actually think of the process as actually villains of this particular setting. They're no more villains than white blood cells are, I don't know what else to say. I mean, you're probably thinking, well, what do you think the process are? I've kind of already given it away. They're the white blood cells. They are the code that keeps the universe functioning in the way that it does. And again, whether you think they're in a Tron situation or if you think they're just in a setting that functions like a computer program, that would be logical that something like them would exist. The things that basically have access to everything. The things that have access to the code. Oh, this leads me to my final point, by the way. What is the country and the ending? Now, I really hate to say this, but so you noticed how the country was visible in the final battle, right? I'm sure you did. And it's pretty obvious that the country is in the Transistor to some extent or another. I mean, the most common theory I've heard talked about is that the country is basically the recycling bin. I think I've mentioned that before. But I don't think that's true. Basically, because of the non-morphic nature of the setting, or excuse me, the non-linear nature of the setting, the very morphic nature of the setting, I think there is no country. I think there is no place they go to. I think they can be in the Transistor, of course. But I think they basically just die. And that bit at the end is basically their final moments as they're getting to meet each other again before they fade completely in whatever format that they do, before they empty the recycling bin, basically. And I know that sounds horrible because some people look at this and think that it's a good ending, a very happy ending. I don't. Now, granted, you guys know that I tend to be a horrible, depressing person, but I think the ending is stronger if she does actively commit suicide with no thoughts to go to heaven effectively with him or to go to the country, which I'll talk about in just a little bit more detail in a sec here, but instead was just killing herself to kill herself. She's done. There's no one left. The city's empty. She could remake the city. What's the point? There's no one there. And she has no method to make anyone else be there. She can't release anyone else from the Transistor. And the fact that she realizes she can't release anyone from the Transistor is why she kills herself. Whether because she was attached to Blue in particular, or the fact that that means she knew she'd be alone forever, except for his voice. Take your pick. Or both, for that matter. The country, then. Some people have theorized, is the country the outside world? Is this either a pocket dimension, or a rip in space-time, or, again, a computer program. To use the Tron metaphor, what if going to the country just means they're back out into the real world, like happened in the original Tron, but also in the new Tron? I've kind of already given my thoughts on that. I really do think the recycling bin metaphor is apt, and I don't basically I don't think I think the country is a metaphor. I don't think it literally exists. I think it's just a memory. I think it's memory. I don't mean literally. I mean in computer terms, as in temporary, as in once that memory gets purged, whoosh, it's gone. But things do sit in memory for a bit while they're while they're still active. That's just my take on it. So much of this game is interpretive. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. I'd love to hear what you guys think, and let me know, because that'd be cool. I'll talk to you guys otherwise next time.